And on behalf of IISD, I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar, Rethinking Investment Treaties, Lessons for Policymaking. Before we dive into today's discussion, let me cover a few housekeeping details. This webinar is public and will be recorded, and we will share the recording with you afterwards, so feel free to forward it to your colleagues who couldn't join us live. We also offer live interpretation in French and Spanish, so to select your preferred language, as usual, click the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now, let's turn to today's topic. If you are with us today, you likely recognize the widespread consensus that investment treaties and ISDS system are flawed, posing threats to climate action, environmental protection, and social justice. Over the past 2 decades, significant efforts have been made to terminate or reform these treaties and the ISDS mechanism. This ongoing work involves a diverse area of stakeholders, including government officials, international and regional institutions, NGOs, think tanks, academia, and the media. Thank you all for your dedicated and hard work. Despite the proliferation of reform initiatives, however, progress has been slow and often lacks the ambition and holistic direction needed to address the challenges we face. And one of the primary hurdles, in our view, has been the absence of concrete alternative approach tailored to the need of this century. Developing such an approach requires, of course, a collaborative, global effort and innovative thinking. And at IISD, we aim to contribute to this collective endeavor by asking the right questions and fostering open dialogue. This is why we were excited to release 2 weeks ago our latest publication, Rethinking Investment Treaties, a Roadmap. This report outlines a vision of redesigning investment treaty system to support sustainable development rather than hinder it. And my colleague will soon post the links to the full report and the executive summaries in the chat available in French, Spanish, and English. As you will see, our reports build on the incredible work done by many institutions, NGOs, and academics in this field, and we are pleased to offer it as a resource to enrich and inspire ambitious initiatives. This publication, we'll notice as well, is the second of our new series on Rethinking Major Investment Governance Legal Tools, where we focus more on the formulation of policy objectives that such tools could pursue and policy problems they could address. With the support of donors and partners, we aim and hope to embark on a broad consultation process to define what an investment treaty model 2.0 should focus on and should look like. And we seek input from stakeholders across all regions and sectors and beyond the investment community, so we can benefit from diverse expertise and perspectives. So this is only the start of the conversation. Stay tuned for more updates. Today's session will present our proposed roadmap for rethinking investment treaties and kick off discussion that will shape, we hope, our future steps. First, we will conduct a brief poll to get a sense of who is on the webinar and also understand what are your priorities. Then the report co-authors, Josef Ostřanský, Policy Advisor at IISD, and Jonathan Bonnitcha, Associate Professor in Law at the University of New South Wales and Senior Associate at IISD, will introduce the key findings of the report. Following this, we'll have the pleasure of a panel discussion with our distinguished guests and experts. Dafina Atanasova, Economic Affairs Officer at the International Investment Agreement sections of the Division of Investment and Enterprise at UNCTAD. Benton Heath, Associate Professor at at Temple University, Berkeley School of Law. Alessandra Mitsura, Policy Analyst in the Sustainable Investment Unit at the OECD's Investment Division. Roselyne Guénaud, Senior Investment Expert at the IFCFTA Secretariat. Chantal Ononawu, Director of External Trade at the CARICOM Secretariat. Joshua Payne, Senior Lecturer in Law at the University of Bristol. We were expecting also Juanita Rushat, Senior Official at the Services and Investment Division of the ASEAN Secretariat, but due to last-minute constraint, she might not be able to join us today. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion, especially given this challenging time for some of you. And let me remind the audience that our panelists today will be speaking on their personal capacity, not representing their organization official position. Now, We only have 1 hour and a half of exciting discussion, so please feel free to enter your feedback, reaction, and comments in the chat box during the discussion, and we will do our best to respond in the chat. Without further ado, I will hand the floor over to my colleague, Lucas Schaug, Policy Advisor at IISD, who will run the brief poll. Over to you, Lucas.
Thanks a lot, Susie, and welcome everyone to this webinar on Rethinking Investment Treaties. Before we start with the actual panel discussion, we would like to run a little poll with some questions to give our experts and panelists a better sense of your prior knowledge and the focus of your work and background. So let me start right away with the questions. I'm going to launch the poll now, and you should be able to see it now. So I will first let you answer all 4 of the questions listed and then show you the results. So the first question is, what do you think the global fossil fuel consumption subsidies amounted to in 2022? Was it 150 billion, 250 billion, 600 billion, or 1 trillion US dollars? That's the first question. Second question is, what sector do you work in? In government, in civil society organization, or for an NGO, in academia, in the private sector as part of business or industry, or in legal practice? The third question is your country currently reviewing or has it recently reformed its investment treaties or its model investment treaty? And here you have the option to choose multiple different answers: concluding new treaties, revising the model treaty, replacing old treaties with new ones, or terminating old treaties. And a final question, what do you think are the most important policy issues that an investment treaty should address? Again, you can choose multiple options: facilitate sustainable investment, regulate investment incentives, provide for investment protection and dispute settlement, ensure that foreign investors respect national laws, CSR, RBC, create mechanisms for cooperation on investment governance, or ensure that foreign investment benefits the host country and their population. So I can see the answers coming in. I'm still going to wait. We have a couple of answers already. All right, still see some answers coming in. Going to give you another 10 seconds. Okay, we have almost all participants answering the questions now. And I'm gonna end the poll now. And you should be able to see the results now. I hope that's the case. All right, so for the first question, we can see that most of you think that the global fossil fuel consumption subsidies are high, with 39% thinking it's 600 billion US dollars and 41% thinking it's 1 trillion. For the second question, we can see that most of you work for government or academia, followed by civil society and the private sector. The third question, is your country currently reviewing or has it recently reformed its investment treaties? Many countries appear to be concluding new treaties, 41%. Also the revision of model treaty, 38%, replacing old treaties with new ones, 34%, followed by termination of old treaties, 14%. And finally, the question on the most important policy issues. Here we can see that 66% think it should be to facilitate sustainable investment, and then 61%, 66%. Then we can see 14 out of 38 thinking it's regulating investment incentives, followed by providing investment protection and dispute settlement. That appears to be lower. You can also see a considerable number of participants thinking that it should ensure that foreign investment and foreign investors respect national laws, CSR, RBC. So it's pretty evenly spread out, although the part on investment protection and the regulation of investment incentives appear to be lower. So a very interesting set of responses here that should hopefully inform our discussion today. And so for that, I'm going to hand over the floor to my colleague Josef for the actual panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucas, and good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I'll just mention that for those who are interested in knowing what is the answer to the first question regarding the subsidies, I'll just direct you straight to the report because you will find the answer to that question there. So I'll now summarize the paper or its main findings, but given that we have a full lineup of brilliant speakers with us today, I'll try to be very brief and focus rather on the approach and framing of the paper. Discussions about reforming investment treaties have been with us for many years now. Many proposals, as Susie mentioned, from academics, CSO organizations, and international organizations have been tabled. And not entirely surprisingly, the majority of these discussions start with the problems posed or caused by the existing treaty regime. And with this paper, we wanted to contribute to this debate, but by taking a step back and asking the following question, which is on the next slide. If we can move to the next slide. So if we were building the investment treaty regime from scratch today, what policy problems should the regime seek to solve? And how should it contribute to solving these problems? So it is a sort of exercise of clean slate thinking when we try to screen out the problems posed by the stock of existing treaties and think about what treaties really can do to solve different policy problems. But it is not a clean slate thinking that would be disconnected from the policy realities on the ground, because we built on the existing work and proposals that identified the main policy problems of investment governance by organizations such as UNCTAD, OECD, or CCSI, and many others. So we are not reinventing the wheel when it comes to especially the identification of the policy problems. On the next slide, so we can see that the first issue here, if we took this approach, was to identify the policy problems. And in this sense, we relied and built on the existing work which have been created up to this point. So the main target with this paper was then to consider, regardless of how important a policy problem is, a policy problem of investment governance, is treaty the right instrument to tackle it? Why is the treaty right instrument? Under what conditions is treaty a right instrument to address a certain policy problem? And this is where we recognized that the limits of this paper and decided to frame it as a first step in a broader collective efforts, because we were able to identify main considerations to keep in mind when deciding on the role of a treaty to address a specific policy problem. But we stopped short of proposing how a treaty should regulate that given problem. This means that this second step is not really included in this paper, which we consider as a roadmap, as it will require more work and more reflection, and is ideally conducted as a collective collaborative effort. So as a result, the paper is deliberately thin on actionable policy recommendations. However, we have some points to consider and questions that policymakers may ask when they think about approaching or addressing a certain policy problem through investment treaty. So on the next slides, on the next 3 slides, I will just very briefly mention the policy problems which we address in this paper, or which we discuss in this paper. So first category of problem, and the paper uses 3 categories of policy problems. First are policy problems that relate to the encouragement and support of sustainable investment, which has been widely recognized in one of the main issues in achieving sustainable development goals. Here we looked at the classic 4 categories of tools that are used to encourage sustainable investment, and the color coding is essentially points that in the yellow you will see that categories where we find that treaties might have little role in addressing problems of, for instance, liberalization and investment protection, because they may rather create more costs than add benefits. In the turquoise 2 boxes regarding investment incentivization and facilitation, we thought and we saw that there is some role for treaties to addressing some aspects of the use of, for instance, subsidies, or how home state measures regarding investment facilitation are adopted. So we saw that there's some limited role for treaties there. How that should look like, we left that unanswered in that paper. And the second category on the next slide is that which relates to regulating the impacts of investment projects. And that essentially boils down to 2 things: averting negative social and environmental impact, and boosting the positive impact of foreign investment. And here again, we found that treaties may have some role, but it is especially and probably only when the interface between the treaty regulation and the domestic regulatory frameworks, which are probably best adapt to addressing the question of regulation of investment project, is well thought of. On the third category, and that's with which I would conclude, is a cross-cutting category of investment governance issues and institutional questions. And here we see that one category here is in blue, and that's where we thought that there's probably where treaties can be most useful when addressing problems of investment governance. Those are really problems of typical collective action problems where states cannot address them on their own or are unwilling to address them on their own. Questions such as fossil fuel subsidies, or obstacles and incentives for technology and knowledge transfer across different countries, or regulatory cooperation, and more generally creating lasting platforms for cooperation between states. When it comes to bolstering national institutional frameworks, again, we found limited role, and again, that interface between the treaty and domestic law and other levels of regulation needs to be thought through. So with this paper and with this webinar, we hope to launch and seg into the next phase of this project, where we would like to be more comprehensive and look how exactly the treaties could address, to the extent that they could address some of these problems. So that is from me, and I will now turn to Jono to kick off the discussion with our esteemed panelists. Over to you, Jono.
Thanks so much, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to jump straight in by posing the first in what will be a series of questions to our panelists. And the first question is for Defina and then for Alessandra. And the question is, the report identifies 3 categories of policy problems that can be potentially addressed by treaties. Based on your work at UNCTAD and the OECD respectively, what main policy problems do you see as apt for treaty-level regulation? Are some areas more important than others? And are there some areas perhaps that we missed in this report?
Thank you very much, Jono, for starting this conversation. Thank you very much to IISD for the opportunity to contribute to the views regarding this excellent report. And before delving into the specific question, let me just congratulate IISD and the authors for the excellent paper on what are core questions on the future of international investment policymaking. Amid growing understanding that traditional investment treaties have largely failed to deliver on the promise of sustainable development enhancement, investment treaties are increasingly already steering towards new governance issues, thus making this a very timely initiative. UNCTAD has, as you know, long worked on the underused development potential of investment treaties, and in particular on strengthening their link to the social aspect of sustainable development. So the paper provides an excellent opportunity to continue moving this discussion forward on the best ways to enhance the developmental impact of international investment instruments. The paper provides also a timely framework for thinking about the best ways to do so, and points to the main policy problems and roles the treaties can take. In this context, a key element of the paper that aligns with our experience is to bring to light the potential of investment treaties and as instruments for lasting cooperation between the parties. Under this umbrella, as the authors point out, treaties can be catalysts for policy change under certain circumstances for domestic institutions. They can create links between relevant domestic actors in support of sustainable investment. They can put in place, and this is the strong suit of the mechanisms to further sustainable development and mechanisms and institutional setups to support countries in their efforts. So as the three types of policy problems that the paper tweezes apart, of course, are interrelated in their final goal. Cooperation-focused investment treaties, I believe, can have their role to play in relation to all of them in certain in our experience, and with the condition that they're guided by the developmental goals, broader developmental goals of the parties involved. So placing the emphasis on cooperation and flexible commitments, investment treaties can thus support promotion and facilitation measures for sustainable investment. They could do so by addressing, by providing institutional backstopping and fostering cooperation between the parties' domestic institutions to enhance business links and relations. They can do so by ensuring the availability of technical assistance, in particular in the context of parties at different stages of their economic development. They can do so, as the authors rightly know, for questions that cannot be addressed at the national level, such as addressing cost of capital problems and financing, which are sore and key questions in the developing world. We are, in a sense, already seeing the advancement of many such flexible instruments that work towards the goal of facilitating and promoting investment. And what we see is that parties are looking towards instruments that enhance cooperation and steer away from binding dispute settlement. So that is one. In addition, again, similarly, through their cooperation function, investment treaties can do a lot to support existing domestic policy frameworks to ensure the positive and avoid the negative impacts of investment activities in host states of investment. And in this respect, from our point of view, technology transfer and diffusion and the support treaties could give in that respect is a key problem, and one where international cooperation could be of high added value to countries. We see early developments in this respect in agreements such as the African Continental Free Trade Area Investment Protocol, but of course much more remains to be done, and much more work that we're looking forward to contributing to remains to be done. An additional aspect, and conversely, is to point to the responsible investment conduct in host countries, and in particular investor obligations, which, if, as the authors rightly point, if coordinated well with domestic policy frameworks, can serve to complement them and to strengthen them further. And as a result, to contribute to avoiding the negative impact of investment activities on both the countries and their citizens. Finally, and this is where, from my point of view, we can further develop the conversation without detracting at all from already the exciting and comprehensive qualities of the paper. Treaties can, I think, also serve as a basis to link social aspects of sustainable development, of poverty alleviation, more directly with investment policy making. And here, I think we could further the discussion, and the authors could continue working on that aspect in future papers and in future elaborations. As it is one of the key reasons for, one of the key developmental reasons for the existence of these treaties. So I look forward to continuing this key discussion on the best ways for treaties to work on actionable policy recommendations in the future. But in the meantime, just congratulations on putting on paper an incredibly clear framework for thinking about these complex yet core issues of our field.
Thank you so much, Defina. Alessandra, I might put the same question to you now.
Absolutely. And again, thank you to IISD for both the invitation and also for organizing this very, very timely event. And congratulations again for the excellent paper that you have produced. It's really built on and brings together several issues and strands of ongoing work that we that are honestly the subject of conversation in several different forums, and including within the OECD. So from what concerns our work, we are especially looking at what I believe you mentioned in the paper as category 1 policy problems. So how investment treaties can support sustainable investment. And in this area, we do start from the consideration that investment treaties can indeed play a role in encouraging sustainable investment and discourage unsustainable ones. But the question that remains is how they do so. And essentially, to answer this question, one must look at both how to design future treaties and also how to fix the ones that are already in place. We are considering both aspects under the future of investment treaties work that we are carrying out at the OECD and that we launched in 2021. And initially, our work under this umbrella covered several of the policy issues that are also mentioned in your paper. So the role of international investment agreements in contributing to sustainable development, their role in supporting responsible business conduct, improving investment market access, or facilitating FDI. And eventually, the discussions in this forum became much more focused and essentially concentrated on 2 separate tracks. Track 1 discussions, where we look specifically at actually one of those category 3 problems that you identify in the paper. So the alignment of investment treaties with the Paris Agreement, looking both at the broader do no harm umbrella. So analyzing issues such as fossil fuel carve-outs or the reduction of fossil fuel benefits, and also positive agenda in the sense of the role of investment treaties in encouraging low carbon investment. And then we also have an ongoing work under track 2, which considers how to transition from older substantive clauses in investment treaties that have a design that is no longer useful or responsive to government priorities to new language that might help better address current policy problems. What I want to focus on today, though, is a more recent strand of work that we're carrying out at the OECD that looks also at the positive agenda in the sense that it's focused on how investment treaties can support sustainable investment. And essentially, it starts from the question on how treaties, especially recent treaties, are aligning with a whole of government approach to sustainable investment that emerges from a wide range of standards that have been developed by international organizations, including the OECD under the recommendation on FDI policies for sustainable development. And the peculiarity of this whole of government approach is that it is not strictly limited to issues of sustainable development or investment facilitation, but rather looks more broadly at a whole range of domestic measures that government can adopt to improve their own domestic climate on investment and ensure that this is actually conducive to sustainable development goals. So there are among the elements that are usually considered under a whole of government approach are, for example, the importance of interagency coordination in policy design, the implementation of periodical and ongoing assessments of the impacts of both policies, investment policies, and FDI itself on sustainable development related objectives, the need to design an incentive regime that is transparent, but also aligned with sustainable development aims, how to promote and facilitate investment to support low carbon transitions or objectives linked to gender equality, and also the broader role that societal actors play in supporting sustainable investment. And what we found in our research is that several of these whole of government components are also appearing in newer treaties, with states committing to implement relevant measure domestically. So these provisions, for example, emerged in the recent EU-Angola Sustainable Investment Agreement, the investment protocol to the AFCFTA. We have found some also in the WTO investment facilitation for development agreement. And what we also found through our research, and this is something that I believe is very important to stress, is that such kind of treaty language by itself, it's not enough to attract sustainable investment. It is useful because it can still have a signaling values concerning the parties' commitments to sustainable investment, but it will not automatically translate to either an improved investment climate in the whole state or to an automatic increase of sustainable investment, unless it is followed by effective implementation at the domestic level. And this sort of issue of domestic implementation is really key when we discuss the role of investment treaties in promoting or facilitating sustainable investment. And at the same time, this is also not something that has received a lot of attention in recent practice. And there is not even consensus as to what effective implementation actually mean, especially concerning these new provisions on whole of government approach to sustainable investment. So essentially what we're focusing on right now is identifying tools that can support domestic implementation of a sustainable investment provision in investment treaties. And a first tool is the role that treaty-based mechanisms of cooperation, like joint committees, can play in supporting domestic implementation. These are mechanisms that are already included in a wide number of treaties. And at least on paper, these mechanisms are already provided with functions relating to oversight and facilitation of implementation, including, for example, the power to issue recommendations to the parties, or explore opportunities for technical assistance and capacity building. And so there might be a role for this body, if properly structured and implemented, to support parties' effort to implement treaties provisions domestically. Equally important is the work that different international organizations are doing with partner countries to improve investment climate. And so essentially exploring the roles that different instruments such as investment policies and impact reviews, needs assessments, benchmarking exercises can be linked to investment treaty implementation. And lastly, it's also important to mention the role of development cooperation and in particular in alignment with national development priorities on sustainable investment, and also the role that it can play to support the implementation and international commitments. So these are all areas where we are focusing on right now, but on which definitely a conversation with other stakeholders and actors would be important in the future. And so we look forward to continuing our conversation on these issues.
Thank you so much, Alessandra and Dafina. Now I would like to turn the debate to the question we've seen from Dafina and Alessandra. What are the policy problems and on which the different organizations have been working towards solving through various instruments? But I would like to ask Josh and Ben specifically a little bit more about the role of treaties as such. Where do you think that treaties may be most effective as policy tools in addressing investment governance problems, and why is that? Why the treaty is better than different instruments? And I will start with Josh first.
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks to IISD for the invitation. So I think there's a couple of functions of treaties I'll touch on in response, but firstly, as sort of has already been touched on, I think the report's right to argue that treaties can play a particular role where there are collective action problems. So where the policy problem is just so big that no single state can solve it, or where states may be reluctant to act as a first mover because of competitiveness concerns. So I think that broad function, examples of that have already been touched on, would be phasing out public support for unsustainable investments, or potentially going further and committing in a treaty to phasing out, say, fossil fuel projects over time. I think they're exactly the kind of issues where states may be reluctant to be a first mover. Another important collective action problem I'll just touch on that's also been mentioned is whether there's a role for treaties in facilitating some kind of plurilateral or multilateral effort to overcome the challenges around costs of financing and costs of capital for sustainable investments. There I would just note, I think it's really an open question whether a treaty, an internationally legally binding instrument, is necessarily the best kind of tool to resolve that issue, or whether something more flexible like a non-binding memorandum of understanding may actually be better suited. Just to finish, I think, lastly, I think the report is correct to argue that there are a set of issues or problems where the role of investment treaties can essentially be in complementing and reinforcing national legal frameworks. And I think there's a couple of examples of that are touched on in the report. So one example would be on investor obligations. The report, for example, suggests a treaty-based obligation for each treaty party to make their domestic legal system available for civil redress in relation to harm that might be done by investment activities. Another example of where I think treaties have a role in potentially, again, reinforcing or perhaps supplementing national legal frameworks is more on the investment facilitation front. The report touches on kind of rights to participate in decision-making around investment activities. And the report kind of rightly argues that those rights to participate should not just be provided to investors, but need to be provided to other actors who are affected by investment activities. And I'll just finish by noting in free trade agreements, some transparency, good regulatory practices chapters are framed in that broader manner. For example, they apply to interested persons rather than simply to investors.
I'll just begin?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. And this has been a great discussion. I want to align myself with basically everything that Josh said, especially around solving collective action problems and the examples that he gave for where treaties might be potentially useful. I think there's a great box at the beginning of the full paper that sort of describes in sort of abstract but useful language the various functions that a treaty might play in the world of investment. and I sort of commend all that to you. If I were to sort of simplify for kind of narrative purposes, I think like treaties really do two things. They solve, they correct for power imbalances within a state, actually, is something that treaties can do. They create another international forum that can sort of alter the pre-existing balance of power within a state. And then the second thing they can do is coordinate across states, right? And so to sort of, I know we're not talking about the bad old investment treaties, but since a lot of you are still concluding them, let's talk about them. They do both of those things, right? So coordinating policy across states is probably the more obvious one. Obviously, these were bilateral treaties, but they were conceived in a moment where folks in the foreign offices of the United Kingdom and the United States were worried about what was being called in the pages of international law journals, third worldism, right? And what was third worldism? It was sort of a new way of thinking about the relationship between the state and the economy that allowed developing states emerging from colonialism to sort of reconfigure the relationship between foreign capital, domestic capital, et cetera. And that might involve things like nationalization and expropriation according to domestic legal standards. And what these original investment treaties were designed to do was to lock in the kind of Western, North American, North Atlantic consensus around what constitutes a legitimate expropriation under international standards to push back against these sort of new norms emerging from the third world, right? And so that was the coordination problem, so to speak, that these treaties sought to solve for, right? They also solve for domestic policy, domestic power imbalances over time, right? So if you look at the earlier treaties, they are designed to remain in force for a very long time, even after states unilaterally terminate them. Why, right? Well, this is very obvious. These were concluded usually, so the first U.S. treaties, which I know most about, I'm American, the first U.S. treaties were concluded between the Reagan administration and friendly governments around the world, places like Zaire, right? And so what you had was you had a government that was friendly to Reagan administration, anti-communist foreign policy, and that was going to be open to Western investment. And what you were worried about was a change in government, right? And so what you did was you sort of locked in a Western-friendly, pro-capital set legal regime, and then sort of you could use that against a leftist government or a right-wing populist government that comes into power later, right? And so that was the idea, right? That's what they do. And so can we use those lessons and reconfigure them to, let's say, more positive ends? Maybe, right? We can maybe do that. So internationally, right, we need to sort of develop consensus around new norms concerning, for example, technology transfer or the power of local communities over investment in their territory, et cetera. And investment treaties could have a role to play in that, right? Again, you have to ask yourself the question, what are we doing? Are we locking in good norms, or are we sort of locking in kind of the most congenial, acceptable to the American and European way of doing things version of those norms, right? But we could see good stuff there. Second, you can use an international forum to correct for a domestic power imbalance. When we talk about investment treaties as lawyers, we're almost always focused on disputes where the state and the investor are on opposite sides and fighting. But as Nicholas Perron and many others have written about, before a taking, there is usually a giving, right? Before the investor and the state are at odds, they are often aligned, right? The state has invited the investor, has offered them many incentives, et cetera, et cetera. And then either as a result of a change in government or simply a change in domestic politics as the harmful impacts of the investment are sort of revealed or made salient, the politics shift, and then the state and the investor are now in a dispute. And so at that ex-ante stage, what you might want to do, maybe, is empower other voices within a state that normally don't have any visibility or power over these givings, right? And to sort of say like, and this is what, for example, the World Bank inspection panel was supposed to do with respect to World Bank finance projects, to sort of give a voice to dissenting folks within the area where a dam was to be constructed, say, right? And so this is something that a multilateral institution can do. It can empower other voices if we choose to do that. But whether or not we can actually get there or what we actually want to do is sort of up to other people than me. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Ben. Although we will get to hear more on that, because the follow-on question, I guess the question you both answered in some ways was a what question, what problems could treaties potentially solve, what functions can they perform? And the following question is the how question, a question of regulatory modalities, as we call them in the paper, because treaties can do different things. They can impose direct obligations on different types of actors. They can create new international institutions or platforms for cooperation. They can require the creation of new domestic institutions or empower existing domestic institutions to perform new roles. They can articulate normative consensus. So in terms of these different regulatory modalities, how do you see future investment treaties potentially tackling some of the problems that you've just articulated?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I'm not sure. I mean, I think so. You've caught me in a very pessimistic week because I used to write a little bit about global health, and I've been following the sort of the stalling of the pandemic treaty negotiations. I don't know if anyone else is familiar, but a few years ago, we had a big pandemic that we were all really concerned about. And one of the things that I thought that we were all on the same page about was that we needed to facilitate investment in public health globally. And that this was going to require, to some degree, a commitment of resources by the wealthier countries to help the least developed and developing countries be able to be resilient in the next pandemic, right? And so that was going to involve things like technology transfer and actual transfer of actual medicines and transfer of capital to improve domestic health systems, et cetera, et cetera. And treaties can facilitate this. They really can. You can create an institutional platform, and frankly, you do it all the time, right? The old global health regime from 2005, I guess that's old now, was all about redistribution. It was about redistributing information from the global south to the global north so that the global north could then protect itself against outbreaks that emerge elsewhere, right? That's a kind of redistribution. It's not really what you want, but that's a kind of redistribution. And then there were soft obligations that were rather meaningless for the global north to then redistribute money and resources back to the global south, right? Investment treaties are about redistributing power, right? Redistributing jurisdictional power and authority away from domestic institutions and to these international fora, right? And so we can do this, but when it comes to actual commitments of capital or actual redistribution of property rights, we see in this like highly charged, very salient, we all remember how bad it was environment, that states are not willing to give very much, right? They are not willing to commit capital, right? And in the green transition and in the world of sustainable investment, we are also going to need a commitment of capital. And states are, it's not that they're not doing anything, they are doing stuff, right? But are they going to commit to a long-term durable platform for the redistribution of technology and resources? I'm not sure. And so what can we get? I think what we can maybe get is thinner, so Alessandra mentioned sort of joint committees, places to talk, places to keep the dialogue open. And that may be all we can get right now. And it may be all the global north really deserves, right? If they come sort of offering you soft obligations about protecting human rights and stuff in exchange for more mandatory international dispute settlement, more investment protections, same old language on expropriation. They are, in a way, I learned this saying recently, trying to sell you your socks, right? They already have soft obligations to help out the Global South. You, the Global South, to the extent that is the audience here, already have the sovereign power to regulate in the public interest, right? Nobody needs to enshrine this in a treaty. What we need is redistribution. And if we don't get that, then pretty much all we can ask for is a place to keep talking about the possibility of getting that. The one sort of last point I'll leave you with is that investment treaties are often bilateral or in sort of small groups. And there, even with something as soft as a talk shop, as a place to sort of keep talking, I'm worried about the quiet room, about these becoming a vehicle for the capital exporting country to pressure the capital importing country one-on-one in a way that sort of breaks collective action, right? A multilateral framework is better, right? A multilateral framework where like-minded states can find each other and act in coalitions to make things happen is much preferable, even if all we're doing is talking. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Ben. And it's a good point to leave it on, because there are, of course, questions about the sort of functions a treaty can perform and the modalities that can be used that depend on whether we are talking about a bilateral treaty or a plurilateral regional treaty or a genuinely multilateral treaty. Josh, have I caught you in a more optimistic week? Do you want to answer that same question I put to Ben about regulatory modalities?
Yeah, so I think here I would maybe pick up on something Ben said. I think future treaties can place a greater emphasis on sort of creating mechanisms or processes for ongoing cooperation between domestic authorities after the treaty is signed. So the report kind of rightly points out that traditionally, to the extent there have been institutions created in the investment treaty regime, they've almost all been focused on dispute settlement. But that is starting to change, and Defina touched on this, particularly in agreements focused on investment promotion or investment facilitation. There is a greater emphasis on, for example, creating committees and giving the committee some kind of concrete work plan or future agenda that it's asked to address after the treaty is concluded. So there I would just say, I think broadly treaties should kind of settle the basic outline of the process. So for example, which domestic authorities are going to be involved, how often they're required to meet, what will be the initial priorities for cooperation. Obviously, though, you do need to leave room for things to evolve over time. Again, I'd just flag, I think it's probably still open to debate whether a treaty, an internationally legally binding instrument, is necessarily the best framework for facilitating that kind of cooperation. The report touches on an example, the Australia-Singapore Green Economy Agreement. So many of you will know that's done as a non-binding MOU, but it's quite an interesting example because it has a whole range of different areas, priority areas for cooperation that are then further elaborated in annexes to the agreement that identify the different sets of regulatory authorities that will work on those issues going forward.
Thank you, Josh. So I would like now to move to the third block, which is lessons and next step. And I wanted to ask our panelists from the two international organizations, Defina and Alessandra, if you can give one key message for the audience with key recommendation, what states should do if they want to redesign their investment treaties from scratch, what would it be? Alessandra, let's start with you now.
So one key message I'm going to give one key message that is actually two combined into one. And essentially, the first message is that first of all, it's important for states that want to redesign their international investment agreements framework not to forget the treaties that are already in place. Essentially, there is still the need to fix what is already in place, including in the sense of ensuring alignment with the Paris Agreement. So examining the role of fossil fuels carve-outs and reduction of fossil fuel benefits, for examples. But when coming, like this issues aside, what I really want to stress when it comes to rethinking investment treaties is that we really cannot forget the issue of domestic implementation, which is something that I've already mentioned before. And this is essentially because, again, newer treaties are starting to incorporate more and more provisions that include significant commitments in terms of domestic policy reform efforts, and this brings consequences for states. So it's important for states committing to, undertake broad reform processes domestically to attract sustainable investment, to be mindful of the level of commitment that they are undertaking, and also especially the efforts that will be required from their side to actually implement such commitments domestically. And at the same time, it's the analysis of domestic policies and what states can do for domestic implementation could also play a role in informing the drafting of international investment treaties. And this is because it can provide guidance essentially on the policy tools and the instruments that are available domestically to then pursue treaty-based objectives. So, for example, commitments relating to the promotion and facilitation of sustainable investment in certain sectors, including decarbonization, low carbon transitions. When including this type of commitments in an international treaty setting, states should be already thinking how they are going to implement these sort of provisions. And the analysis of domestic practices internally, but also externally, what other states are doing can help inform state actions domestically. So, for example, there are examples of states that are establishing one-stop shops dedicated to investment in specific priority sector in the form of green corridors or green carpets. There are examples of initiatives dedicated to implementing skills development programs domestically to increase the capacity of the local labor force to transition to low carbon sectors that can also foster then sustainable investment in decarbonization. So essentially, the analysis, looking at what the states are doing domestically, can influence also the drafting and the identification of policy problems at the international level, and can also be used to guide cooperation in an international setting and help tackle this, global or cross-border policy problems that states are facing. So I think I will stop here.
Thank you, Alessandra. Jafina, what would be your recommendation in this sense?
So, as usual, asking for one recommendation, you're going to get more, but I will try to keep it brief. Based on, in a sense, the one recommendation is let's learn the lessons from what we know of how the international investment treaty regime developed and look at different ways of doing things. And here I would like to stress 3 complementary points I think that would be useful for states. 1, place sustainable development at the core of international investment policy making rather than in its periphery. There is a sustainable development goals investment gap of about 4 trillion annually, in particular in developing countries. And we know that focusing only on the quantity of investment is not enough. Investment has to deliver on specific development objectives of the countries. And in this respect, it is key to put sustainable development at the core of the discussion of what investment treaties should do when countries are discussing, are making those decisions. Two, learning from how the investment regime has worked. It is useful to design treaties that are simultaneously more robust and more flexible for the future. More robust in their ability to positively contribute to delivering sustainable development objectives, and being effective on the ground. And at the same time, more flexible to allow governments to adapt to changing economic and political landscape challenges and circumstances. And finally, and this is key and in a sense mirrors and builds on Alessandra's point, align investment treaties with countries' overall development objectives and priorities. Ensure that international investment treaties are a tool within a coherent panoply to achieve the goals that your government has set forward at national, regional, and international levels. And as treaties become more implementation oriented, make sure to factor in the necessary technical assistance resources for their effective implementation in the future in relation to the commitments that countries take up. And of course, as with anything else, we are talking about the future of investment treaties and of how investment treaties would be had they been redesigned from scratch. I will, of course, point to the relevance and the key importance of dealing with the existence of the old stock of investment treaties currently in force. And that would be the end of my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Daphne. Jono, I think that before we move to the next part, when we ask our guest speakers from regional economic integration organizations, perhaps to use 5 minutes to react what the panelists and the wealth of interesting ideas and reactions we got on our paper. Do you want to start? I have one or two favorites to which I would like to react, but I'll let you take the floor first.
Sure, thanks, Joseph. I'll try and be brief. And I want to begin by really thanking all the panelists for their thoughtful and deep engagement with their questions, both here in the seminar and also more widely in their work. We wanted with this paper to try and start a discussion about thinking a bit differently about what investment treaties could be and to pose a different sort of question. And I think, from this interaction, I feel like we've been really successful in starting a really interesting discussion. There's so much to respond to, and the academic in me just wants to go straight in and dive into all the detail, but in 2 minutes and in this format, that's probably not very helpful. And I'm conscious also that maybe there are people on the call who haven't actually had a chance to read the paper in full yet. It's quite a long paper. So I actually just wanted to go back and sort of really highlight 3 of the high level themes of what I think we were trying to do here. So the first theme, and hopefully this is clear by now, is we were trying to move the discussion really beyond a discussion about investment protection. So of course, we understand the very serious problems with existing investment treaties, and I agree with the consensus. I think it's been said by several people that we can't forget about the problems with the existing treaties. We need to address the existing stock of investment treaties and the problems associated with those models, which are well known. But at the same time, because we have this constant stream of ISDS cases and this discussion that is focused around the existing regime, it's easy to get a bit too close, and it can be useful to take a step back, because I think Joseph and we would say investment protection is not the biggest problem in investment governance internationally today. A lack of protection for foreign investors is not a significant problem, really. It's if we look around and see the sorts of issues and policy challenges relating to investment, and we started to think about what would we prioritize if we had to prioritize, we wouldn't start with treaties that were focused on investment protection. So we're trying to really move a forward-looking discussion away from the focus of existing debates on investment protection. And in doing that, the second theme, I think, in the paper is that that can be quite broad, but we don't have to start from scratch because there are so many other policy processes going on. There are new types of treaties, but there are also, even beyond what we might think of as investment treaties, there are many investment policy processes going on internationally that we can pay attention to. So if I pick one really easy example, in a lot of investment treaties that are focused on investment protection, governments are expected to act transparently towards investors. They're expected to publish laws and disclose administrative decisions that affect investors. There is a whole body of international investment policy making that is concerned with investor disclosure, so with beneficial ownership registries, with questions of contract transparency, disclosing payments that are made to government. So these are really important questions of investment governance that are being overlooked in existing sets of discussions about investment treaties. So we're trying to really open up a set of discussions about what might be investment treaty issues. But that brings me to, I guess, the third theme, which is to say we also are sort of asking questions more than we're providing answers. And we're asking questions in a way that we hope is really realistic about the limits of what can be achieved through treaties as an instrument. So part of the discussion as well is encouraging thinking about what are the really pressing problems of investment governance globally, but also are treaties actually any use here? And in answering that question about appropriate roles for treaties, one way we think it's helpful to approach it is to focus particularly on some of the ways that treaties interact or intersect with other institutional processes, domestic regulatory frameworks, that sort of thing. Joseph, over to you.
Thanks, Jono. I think that as we have one round of reaction, I will reserve my 2 points towards the end, and I will now move to our guest speakers from regional economic integration organizations and ask their experience with reforming investment treaties. So I'll ask first Chantal Onnaiwu from CARICOM. What investment policy problems you perceive as most urgent and most important in your region, and what your organization or member states have they chosen to tackle them through treaties, and have the treaty been the selected instrument in tackling some of these investment policy problems? Over to you, Chantal. And thanks for joining this early.
No problem. Thank you very much, Joseph. And like other colleagues, I really would like to thank the IISD for this very timely piece of work and the opportunity to share some perspectives from the Caribbean community, CARICOM. I just wanted to start out in answering the first question about the investment policy problems that are most urgent to tackle in CARICOM by just recalling that small states such as those in CARICOM, they're really heavily dependent on FDI to advance their sustainable development objectives and imperatives, whether we're talking about areas such as renewable energy, sustainable oceans management, or even in the area of addressing concerns about food security. And so some of the most pressing policy problems that we've had to tackle in the region, and here I'm going to use the typology used in the report, are really those that focus on encouraging and supporting sustainable development and regulating the impact of investment projects. I would add, though, that countries in the region do face certain challenges, such as the costs of financing sustainable investment projects, and we face various capacity constraints that we have found can be addressed through collective action or through international cooperation. And so I'll touch on this in responding to the second question that focuses on the extent to which treaties have been used as the instruments to address these problems. In terms of encouraging and supporting sustainable investment, I do want to stress that many of the responses that CARICOM member states have taken are at the national level. They have taken actions at the national level to target certain restrictions on foreign investment that they don't think are particularly useful. They do often directly incentivize foreign investment through the extension of tax incentives to investors. And they do and continue to adopt various investment facilitation measures at the national level. And they have engaged in collaborative efforts at investment facilitation at the regional level. And here I would flag two useful initiatives, the Caribbean Association of Investment Promotion Agencies, and also our Regional Trade and Investment Promotion Agency, Caribbean Export. But treaties have been used to encourage investment. I will enter a caveat about whether the treaties have targeted the encouragement of sustainable investment, because I don't think many of them have been crafted in that way. But I do want to recall that our constituent treaty for CARICOM, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, as part of a broader initiative to establish a single market, it does feature guarantees of the right of establishment and free movement of capital for community nationals. And so investment liberalization commitments do feature there. Individual CARICOM countries have made investment liberalization commitments in some of their bids, for instance, those that have bids with Canada and the US. And the economic partnership agreements between the CARIFORUM states and the EU and the UK also feature some investment liberalization commitments. But I do want to stress that these investment liberalization efforts have not been targeted in a focused way on investments that could be considered sustainable investments or investments that have been identified that to particularly contribute to sustainable development. Member states have also used treaties as a platform for cooperation on promoting investment. The economic partnership agreements that I flagged can be cited in this regard. But I do want to flag the cooperation and facilitation of investment agreements that Brazil has concluded with Suriname and Guyana in this regard as useful examples. And I want to underscore how I think illustrative those treaties are of how cooperation between countries that's targeted at specific initiatives and it's supported by institutional arrangements that can allow for regular and sustained exchanges between the parties, I think can be particularly useful. I do want to point out as well that some bilateral investment treaties, the same cooperation and facilitation of investment agreements between Brazil and Suriname and Guyana have been concluded to try and facilitate investment as well. And 6 CARICOM WTO members do participate in the WTO investment facilitation for development agreement. What I want to stress is that those countries that participate in the agreement during the negotiating process strongly advocated for the inclusion of commitments on technical assistance and capacity building that could support their adoption of investment facilitation reforms at the national level. And they also strongly advocated for the use of needs assessments as an important tool to support those efforts. I would point out that countries in the region largely rely on their national frameworks to try and avert the negative impact of investment projects or to strongly encourage the positive impacts of investment projects. But there are some treaties that I think which have been concluded that can usefully support the efforts that countries have made at the national level. And I'll just cite 2 examples here. The economic partnership agreements between the CARIFORUM states and the EU and the UK, they do feature obligations placed on states to to undertake measures that can promote certain investor behavior or avert certain problematic behavior, such as bribery on the part of investors. And the cooperation and facilitation of investment agreements between Brazil and Suriname and Guyana, they do encourage investors to voluntarily adopt standards of responsible business conduct. So I think those are two useful examples of agreements that can support the efforts that countries take at the national level. To close off, I would highlight how countries have sought to pursue collective action to address some of the challenges that they face in this regard. Where financing the costs of capital are concerned, I'm not going to cite a treaty example. I do want to spotlight an example of a different type of initiative encouraging collective action that at least one member state of CARICOM has been at the forefront in the international community in pressing, and that's the Bridgetown Initiative, which is a policy proposal that has been advanced by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, which really is seeking to reimagine or reconfigure global financing. It's a very targeted several-point plan that is seeking to encourage the international community to undertake measures that can address this chronic problem that small states, such as those in CARICOM, face with trying to face the costs of the capital that would be needed to advance some of the initiatives, that the development imperatives that they're pursuing. I do want to flag that CARICOM countries, particularly when concluding agreements with countries at higher levels of development, have sought to infuse in those treaties mechanisms for technical assistance and capacity building. The EPAs I've mentioned are good examples. I've already flagged how the participating CARICOM WTO members in the investment facilitation for development in the agreement in the WTO sought to do so. I just want to end by, because I know my time is limited, by stressing that technical assistance and capacity building, when these commitments are infused into treaties, we should understand that in this area, they shouldn't only be directed at implementing reforms that can improve the domestic regulatory environment. They really also should be directed at the development of the expertise and the institutional capacity that countries need to facilitate the types of investment that meet their particular sustainable development needs. There's more that I could say, but I am conscious that other speakers need to share their perspective, so I'd end here.
Thank you so much, Chantal. I will now turn and ask the same two questions to Roslyn. Roslyn, floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joseph. And thank you to IISD for this meeting. And actually, I wish to reiterate what other panelists have spoken concerning the very well put document. As I was reading it, it raised more questions to me because it was asking those questions, and I was saying, okay, so the work that we have doing with respect to policy development within the treaty space, how do we then how do we evaluate that? So those are the questions that was coming up as I was reading this document. But to answer what you have asked, the policy problems, as we, and I'm basing my interventions especially on the AFCFTA protocol on investment, what led to the negotiation of the protocol on investment, and what countries mentioned as their key objectives to negotiating this continental treaty. So we have about 3 very key policy problems that the African countries have mentioned, and we have actually seen that these are critical and they're urgent to tackle within the continent. We have the fragmented and oftentimes the insufficient legal and regulatory frameworks that exist within the national space. And this has caused uncertainty. For example, it is difficult for investors, from what we have been given, it's difficult for investors to identify what are the steps that they need to take if they need to invest in a country, what are the requirements, sector-based or non-sector-based, who do they see? So many times this is one of the challenge that has been brought up. The second serious challenge is the limited access to finance or the cost of capital. That has been cited also even by other panelists. The third one is the infrastructure deficiencies. And this has been highlighted also and includes, for instance, what has been mentioned by our countries is energy, telecoms, transport, that hinder both investment and trade. And this hampers the investment in these countries. The final one is a broad socioeconomic challenge that include the current issues around climate concern, the quality of jobs, the healthcare and education. So broadly, those are the four policy problems that came out while we were negotiating protocol on investment. And yes, we have seen that member states are working on addressing these concerns. Now, to answer the question on how the organizations have chosen or how state parties have chosen to tackle these problems, and if the treaties have been selected as instruments, I will answer that yes, treaties have been selected as instruments. Before I come to the objectives of the AFCFTA agreement, let me just go back to what has been done in the region and what has led to the Continental Agreement. And we see that the objectives of modern investment agreements in the Africa region have focused on fostering the economic prosperity of the states. And they have included the need for promoting long-term, holistic, and inclusive sustainable development. So, for example, we see the Pan-African Investment Code, which contains references to sustainable development, and it also contains sustainable development goals. We have the objective of the Pan-African Investment Code as to promote, facilitate, and protect investments that foster the sustainable development of each member state. And in particular, it mentions that the member states where the investment is located. And it also indicates that investors need to contribute to economic, social, and environmental progress with a view to achieving these sustainable development goals. So we also note that PIKE recognizes the second aspect of the policy issue that I mentioned. It recognizes the increasing importance of the development and strengthening of financial and capital markets and the role played by investment and the private sector in the productive capacity and sustainable development. When we come to the COMESA, the Common Investment Area Agreement, which was developed in 2007 and has since been reviewed, we see that it also seeks to promote investments that support sustainable development in its member states. The East Africa Community Model Investment Treaty, which was adopted in 2016, also maintains the objective to promote, to facilitate, to protect, and to increase investments between the investors or between the investors of one state party into the territory of another state party. And we see that there is a similar language that runs across SADC, EAC, Pan-African Investment Code. And we see that these regional treaties, the main intent of the countries is to achieve their national objective, which is to promote sustainable development and which has broader effects of economic development. So I come quickly to the AFCFTA Protocol on Investment, which sits on the mother agreement of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which talks about liberalization, and it establishes the single market, as you may be aware, and free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital. So that addresses the aspect of liberalization, and investment liberalization sits within that. And so the AFCFTA protocol then was negotiated to see how to implement and to to achieve the objective of this investment liberalization. And the protocol, prior to its negotiation, states then sat down and agreed and said, we want to come up with a set of modalities and principles that will give us the key objectives we want to achieve. And they actually mentioned that we have noted that the bilateral investment treaties that we have negotiated amongst ourselves in the African region and also with third parties, but of course the focus was within the African region, are outdated. And they may not have been negotiated with the knowledge of how to achieve these key objectives. And so they gave the modalities that they wanted to see. And these modalities was therefore carried over to the protocol. And I want to actually read them out so that we appreciate that it covers most of the areas that the document has highlighted and has also raised some of those questions. So the protocol reaffirms, first of all, the right to regulate within states, to meet public policy objectives and to promote sustainable development while encouraging investment activities that benefit the countries in the continent generally. And it also addresses underrepresented groups and regions. So the specific objectives set out include encouraging intra-Africa investment flows and opportunities. It also established a balanced, predictable, and transparent continental legal and institutional framework. And therefore, this addresses the issue of fragmented regimes in terms of legal and regulatory issues. It provides a sound legal framework for the prevention, management, and settlement of investment disputes, and therefore addressing the concerns of challenges of dispute or of protection, particularly investment protection. It also encourages it represents a very important element here where it encourages the acquisition and transfer of appropriate and relevant technology in Africa. And here it was discussed that, yes, you can have investment, but this investment will not meet the current challenges that we are facing now in the continent, looking at, for instance, climate change issues. And also the fact that the countries need to advance and develop so that its own communities can then utilize even these technologies and invest amongst themselves. And finally, we have the promotion and enhancement and consolidation of coordinated positions and cooperations on matters related to investment promotion, facilitation, and protection within the continent. So now the reason we have seen the objectives, the second part of
Roslyn, I'm so sorry, and I know that's not fair because being the last speaker is always putting you in that position, but we only have a few minutes left before the end of the webinar. So if you may maybe be a bit short on the second part of the question. Sorry about that.
So the second part, thank you. So I'll finish very quickly. The second part of this is to say, how has the protocol itself highlighted the issues that will need to be implemented to meet these objectives? And under sustainable development, under sustainable investment, we see investor obligations already set out in the protocol. So that is there, and it is not what we call these are mandatory, actually. They are not best endeavors. So this is mandatory. We also have the institutional setup, and the institutional setup to promote and facilitate investment by the establishment of the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency. And this agency was required by states to say, we don't have the technical know-how. We have challenges when it comes to promoting our countries and the continent. So we need an institution that will then have this mandate of promoting and even supporting in capital, identification and support, and also looking at financing and looking at supporting project development in the key areas, the key priority areas of infrastructure and other issues that have been mentioned. And then the other final key matter was on cooperation of investment. And so again, under cooperation, we have it running across the protocol, but being implemented also under the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency. So that is what we have seen within the continent. And in the implementation part, we are seeing actually countries are now expected to, one, terminate African treaties that they have signed amongst themselves, and therefore strengthening the implementation of the protocol. And then the second one is domestication of the protocol on investment. And we are seeing currently there's capacity building processes going on. There is a review of policies going on so that it can align from what the policy with the protocol on investment has, can align with the domestic, that can be aligned. The domestic regulations can now be aligned to the protocol on investment, and therefore enhancing the implementation part of the protocol. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and sorry for rushing you to stop because we are over the time for 1 minute. I know that Joseph wanted to say something, but unfortunately, I'm afraid we won't have the time for that. Fortunately, we had a really engaging discussion on the Q&A, on the chat. For those who haven't had time to have a look, many questions. Sorry for those who are not able to respond to. We will be happy to follow up with you by email or bilaterally as you want. I was saying at the beginning, we only have 1 hour and a half. So it was short, and we can see I was right. But as I said, this is only the beginning of this process and discussion, and we hope to have other opportunities with other stakeholders to continue this discussion. So maybe let me just take a few seconds to provide some concluding remarks to this webinar. First, for thanking everyone for your active participation and the rich discussion we have on the chat. I highly invite everyone to have a look quickly. Your insight and contribution has been very valuable, and as we work together to rethink investment treaties. Before we wrap up, just please take a moment to fill out the survey of this webinar. We have put a link on the chat. It will take you only 30 seconds. So please do it, because that's really important for us to get your feedback. And I will also kindly ask my colleague Isaac to take a group picture for memory of this webinar, kindly asking all the panelists to put the camera on so we can have a nice picture. Thank you very much. And while we are doing so, special thank you to all the speakers and panelists for the insightful discussion. We really appreciate your time and expertise, and we hope you will continue with us on the next journey. Let me also thank the entire IISD investment team working behind the scene to make this event possible. Joseph, Yelena, Isaac, Lucas, Samiksha, thank you everyone. Thanks also to the interpreters for ensuring everyone could benefit from this discussion and the flexibility to go over the time. So having said that, just to ask you to stay tuned for more IISD webinar and next step in this process. And we are looking forward to see you next time. Have a nice day and goodbye. Thank you very much.